Hello everybody, this is Tip Top MTG here today with another Magic the Gathering video. In today's video, I am continuing my Magic the Marveling series with Loki. So if you guys have not seen this series before, I essentially turn every single Marvel Cinematic Universe movie and TV show into a set of Magic the Gathering cards. Each set is a little bit different in size, but it's typically like 50 to 100 cards that represent the characters, items, and events from the movies. And in this video, I'll be talking about the ones I created for Loki Season 1. Now, before we jump into this, I do have a little bit to say. So first off, there will be spoilers. So if you have not seen Loki Season 1, come back because I'm going to be talking about the events and characters of that. Second off, I won't be able to talk about all, I think, like 80 cards that are in this. I'll only be talking about some of the more interesting ones to talk about. Some of the more event-based ones are created, but not in this video. So if you want to see all of those will be in the description down below, along with a link where you can see all my other projects that I've been working on for Magic the Marveling as well. Just last week, for instance, I released Black Widow, and you're getting Loki now because they both came out around the same time, and What If will be next on that list, or maybe Shang-Chi. That will actually probably be next now that I'm thinking about it. But either way, those are some exciting things to look forward to. Why don't we jump right into this? So starting off, let's talk about the mechanic. So recently I've been trying to develop a mechanic for every movie and do it in such a way where they are not just unique to the one thing. So for instance, Loki's mechanic is Diverge. So it's Diverge, a mana cost, and then an ability. And so this will sometimes be something as simple as Double Strike, and it'll sometimes be whole abilities. For instance, one could say Diverge, 1 in a green, tap, add 1 green mana. And that would essentially give the permanent that ability forever. And you can only ever do this once. You can't give this guy Double Strike 4 times, but essentially it's a second state to the card. So let's take a look at this card. We have 1 and a white for a creature, Human Agent Variant, which is a new creature type that is prominently displayed throughout this set. It's a 2/1 with first strike. And then if a creature dealt damage by it this turn would die, exile it instead. So he's going to exile things on hit, aka pruning them, and first strike is going to hit first. But then you can pay 4 mana and he'll kind of go off of his path and be able to hit twice, which then technically, he becomes a much more powerful card. So that's just an example of Diverge in the set. Now, what I've decided to do is break this set into kind of 2 groups, and these 2 cards represent them. So we have Lokis, which are going to be blue and black, and the Time Variance Authority, or the TVA, which will be green, white, and blue. I really wanted to do this for this set because it's presented as if the TVA is good and the variants are bad. And so typically in the set, red, blue, and black are bad guys, and white, blue, red, and sometimes green are the good guys. So I thought it'd be really interesting to see how I could design cards with blue and black being kind of the protagonist of the story and green, white, and blue being the antagonist. So we're not going to talk about these cards specifically, other than they both reference void counters, which is just a reoccurring theme through this set of cards. But just note, if you see cards in these colors, that's what they're going for. And, the reason they share blue is because both of them use Loki, and let's actually talk about him. Loki, the variant. So he is able to be played in a TVA deck or in a Loki deck because he is mono blue. So it's 2 blue for a legendary creature as Guardian God variant. 3/4. So a 3/4 for 4, and it has partnering with Sylvie, the variant, and we'll look at that here in a second. But whenever a variant you control would be put into the graveyard from the battlefield, instead exile it with 2 time counters on it, it gains Suspend. Well, as you know, Loki survive, and that's something they kind of talk about is that, Sylvie is a Loki, and she survives. They all end up in the void. They end up surviving. And this is also just a really fun mechanic. So I felt like being able to, and these are people who are like kind of taken out of their timeline, but because they're Lokis, they're actually going to survive and come back. And so it's kind of this idea of, yeah, they're getting plucked out of their timeline, but don't worry, they'll be back in 2 turns when that suspend is up. And then you have 3 mana and discard a card to create a 2/2 blue variant creature token with Diverge 5. This creature gets +1/+2. So yeah, again, a very basic form of Diverge. You will notice there are cards with more advanced forms of it, but that is essentially the most basic Diverge ability you can get. It's just a boost later on. He's able to go help variants. He goes into the void, again, kind of referencing that. A lot of this was, I don't want, it's very hard designing these cards, finding a balance of both interesting design and lore accuracy. For instance, Loki has a lot of cards, especially when you add in this set, which is going to add a ton of different Lokis. So I have to find a balance of both lore accuracy and uniqueness. For instance, I can't just keep designing the same card over and over again, and I felt like this was a really good balance of that. Either way, then we have Sylvie the variant. It is 4 black for a legendary creature as Guardian God variant, 6/6, so 6/6 for 6 with partner with Loki. Whenever a variant enters the battlefield under your control, if it wasn't cast, draw a card and add black. So again, caring about, variants entering the battlefield, but this time it cares about if it wasn't cast. And that is a little bit of a theme in this set, things that aren't supposed to be done. You're supposed to cast your spells, but it's possible you're resurrecting something or returning from exile or something along those lines. And so you'll notice the Loki team has some things that reward it, and the TVA actually has some stuff that discourages it in a way, and we'll see a little bit of that here. But yeah, it's kind of doing something you're not supposed to do. You're stepping off the timeline. If you were in the graveyard, you should have stayed in the graveyard, but Sylvie is going to kind of reward that. And then you can pay 2 and a black and tap and sacrifice another creature. Each opponent loses life equal to the sacrificed creature's mana value, and you gain that much life. Okay, so let's take a look at these two cards next to each other. Their partner. First off, I design a lot for Commander because Commander's a casual format where legendary creatures kind of not run, they do run the format. And so when I design legendary creatures, I'm designing for Commander because I feel like that's just the most interesting thing I can do. So I tried to get these to work pretty well together because they have partners. So for instance, when you discard that card and pay 3 mana to create the 2/2, you are having a variant enter the battlefield under your control, and it wasn't cast because it doesn't say non-token. Originally, this was a design mistake that I caught, and then I was like, you know what, I want to keep it. And this is one of those ones that I could see in a future update to these cards changing around a little bit. For instance, maybe making it only adding 1 black mana. But then again, you have to understand to get both of those up on the battlefield, that is 10 mana total. So doesn't seem too crazy, does seem pretty powerful though, and that's kind of what I was aiming for. And then the other way it works is that this 2 black tap, sacrifice another creature, and then you get an effect, works with Loki's ability. So the idea is that the one's activated ability triggers the other person's triggered. So Sylvie's activated causes Loki's passive, and they almost undo the other person's cost. So in order for Sylvie to activate an ability, you have to sacrifice a creature. Well, Loki says, you know what, you'll get that creature back. And in order to activate Loki's ability, you have to discard a card, and Sylvie says, oh, well, you'll get that card back. So together, they kind of fix each other's flaws, and I felt like that was a really interesting way to design the two together. Either way, let's move on to Mobius and Mobius. 1 and a blue for a legendary creature, human agent variant, 2/2. So 2/2 for 2. And whenever a creature you control diverges, counter up to 1 target spell or ability. Then you can diverge 1 blue for hexproof. So this one's actually a really, really good card. It is a counter spell on a creature. It is one of those you must kill style of creatures. The reason I put it at 2 mana, and it at one point was 3, I've tried seeing if I could get this effect at 1, and it just didn't end up being anything I liked. 2 is again pushing it, and that's because I feel like a lot of the times I design cards that are just not super great, and I wanted to see how much I could push that in this. Again, power level tweaks in terms of just upping the mana cost of this to 3 wouldn't be a huge deal. It's still the same flavor. But the idea here is that, he's going to be able to kind of be hexproof and counter things. He's going to investigate what's happening and stop bad things from happening. But also, he eventually learns the truth and then diverges. He does end up getting pruned, but he ends up kind of on the right side, quote unquote, in the end. So you can actually play him in a Loki deck, and I really wanted that to be the case. But just from a design standpoint, not talking about lore here, diverge can happen at any time. So essentially how this card is meant to be played is you play him for 2 mana, and then on a later turn, you always have 3 mana to counter a spell. Yeah. And if you have other creatures with diverge, you can counter more and more stuff. So this is just one of those really good cards. If you're looking at it outside of Commander, it does suck that it's legendary, and that is part of what allows it to be at this power level. Is if it wasn't legendary, diverge would probably cost 4. It wouldn't let you counter an ability. You would not be getting hexproof. I think those 3 things are there just because it is legendary. And we also do, by the way, see the return of the agent creature type, which I believe we saw introduced with like Captain America, the Winter Soldier, somewhere back there. And just, it seems to fit pretty well with anyone in the TVA. Next, we have Ravona Renslayer, 4 mana, one of it which being white, for a legendary creature, human agent variant, 3/3. So 3/3 for 4 with vigilance. Whenever a non-land permanent enters the battlefield, if it wasn't cast, its owner adds white, and you put a +1/+1 counter on Ravona Renslayer and gain 3 life. So again, I talked about this kind of being a theme. Now, the hard part is, being able to put stuff on the battlefield without casting it is a very much sideboard ability. So it's very hard to design cards that are like trying to be just good cards that have that tech. So a lot of the time you'll give your opponent an incentive for doing it, but also give you a pretty good incentive as well. And then you can pay X and put a non-land permanent with mana value X from your hand onto the battlefield under your control. Any player may activate this ability, activate only as a sorcery. So now people can decide, oh, you know what? I actually want to add that white mana. And if they do, you get to make Ravona bigger and gain some life. And so it does give you definitely that option. It also lets you cheat a little bit on mana cost in the terms of like, if it's something costs Woober, so 1 white, 1 blue, 1 black, 1 red, 1 green, you can just pay 5 mana of any color. It also lets you avoid extra costs on spells, so you might be able to use this better than your opponent can. But also, if your opponent's doing it, you are getting bigger and bigger on Ravona. And so that is something to keep in mind. So it's just something, the idea behind it is that her first ability is going to be that, when someone is diverging, essentially, or doing what they're not supposed to, Ravona is getting better as a judge and eventually gets promoted up to a judge. Originally was an agent. And so she eventually gets to be a judge based on having enough +1/+1 counters. And then that second ability is almost purely for, mechanical reasons, but a lot of it does come down to she's the reason Loki didn't get pruned immediately, and she definitely causes some of this issue to happen. And so it's a little bit of a nod to that as well. Next, we have Hunter B15, 1 green for a legendary creature, human agent variant, 3/3. Whenever another variant is put into a graveyard or exile from the battlefield, and when Hunter B15 diverges, put a +1/+1 counter on Hunter B15. So it's going to get bigger. Then you can pay 1 green, and you can pay 1 mana for that ability that you're going to get to remove a +1/+1 counter from it to draw a card, and target permanent gains hexproof until end of turn. So what is this doing? It's going to reward you for every time a variant dies or gets pruned, as a hunter. She's again going to get bigger for every target, quote unquote, you take down. Technically, it can be your own, but that's, again, mechanical reasons. And then once she figures out the truth, she diverges and can now kind of take that experience to earn more knowledge. She uses her rank to be able to get to Sylvie to learn more by drawing a card, and then helps protect Sylvie. So this one is very, very lore accurate. Going to build up rank as an actual hunter, and then once you learn the truth, you're kind of using that rank to gain knowledge, and then using that knowledge and stuff to protect Sylvie. So I feel like this just works all around. Next, we have Miss Minutes, 2 white-blue for a legendary artifact creature's construct, 3/4. And it says, whenever a player would scry, instead they reveal those cards and choose one. If the chosen card is a permanent, that player puts it onto the battlefield tapped. Otherwise, they put it into their hand. Put the rest of the cards into exile with void counters on them. Void counters, again, representing things going to the void. And then pay 2 and a blue to tap, and each player scries 3. So you might be thinking, oh, the first one's a symmetrical effect. It is, but typically, even a symmetrical effect can be really good because you are probably building your deck to be better. Again, this is giving people a way to cheat things onto the battlefield, which then you probably have stuff in your deck that rewards you when people cast stuff without paying its mana cost, or, for instance, put stuff on the battlefield. That's actually more accurate. And then that each player scries 3 means each player is looking at the top 3 and putting 1 onto the battlefield or into their hand. So it's kind of a scry mattering deck. Like, if your opponents don't have a ton of scry in their deck, which a lot of people don't, it's not going to do a ton for them. But also, if you have a ton of scry, you're going to get some pretty cool effects out of it. The reference or the lore implications that Miss Minutes is meant to get you time, or not meant to get you time, meant to get you information. And so scrying is a perfect representation of information. Miss Minutes helps even Loki, helps both players. You kind of think about it like that. But then she's able to kind of take that information and turn it into something a little more physical and be able to help, because she is something in the real world, not just a computer. So you're able to make it a little bit more physical. just kind of the concept there. I thought it was an interesting design. I like messing with scry, like whenever you would scry an additional one or something, maybe go on a card eventually. But yeah, I really like this design. Next, we have the Timekeepers and He Who Remains, who's a modal double face card. So it's 2 and a white for a legendary artifact creature Android Advisor, 3/2. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield, if it wasn't cast, it gains this. A creature must attack each combat of Fable. So essentially, if something kind of... Let me first back this up. This whole card is designed to be almost stacksy in a way, because that's what's happening. He Who Remains is setting the rules, and the Timekeepers are kind of the face of that. And so each one has a different effect. So the Timekeepers, if something enters the battlefield, if it wasn't cast, it basically has to attack each turn, which isn't a huge deal, but it kind of represents the people always having to be on the run. If they manage to escape the TVA, you will always be on the run. Then, whenever a creature you don't control attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, then draw a card if you don't control a creature with higher power than the attacking creature. So essentially, the Timekeepers are also then going to be able to boost up their own forces until eventually they have bigger forces than you, and if you do decide to attack, they're just going to learn more about you instead of growing their forces. And so essentially it's going to stop combat eventually, because creatures are going to attack, you're going to get to make your creatures bigger than their creatures eventually, and so if they did want to attack, not only would they be losing a creature, but letting you draw a card. So Timekeeper's trying and keep the multiversal balance in that way. And then He Who Remains is a 5-cost 4/4 with Ward X, where X is the number of advisors you control, and it does not say other, so it always has at least Ward 1. Then it says, if an effect an opponent controls would cause that player to draw a card, except for the first one they draw in each of their draw steps, which is similar text to something like Hull Breacher or Narset. The big difference here is this says an effect an opponent controls, meaning if you make an opponent draw a card, this thing does not trigger. But if your opponents make themselves draw a card, it does. Essentially, instead of them drawing the card, so you cancel their card draw, and you get to make a copy of He Who Remains, who, by the way, now isn't legendary and has this ability. Obviously, we have the reference of, oh, if you kill me, there's going to be a ton of me released. And this is kind of, oh, if you're going to draw the card, learn what happens when I die, try to gain extra knowledge, you're going to release a ton of me into the world. Because, you draw that first card, fine, there's 2 of them. Then there's 4, then there's 8, 16. So very, very crazy, can get insane quickly, but the fact that you can't weaponize it, it is purely defensive, means, in my opinion, it's a pretty fair card. Next, we have Ulysses Black for a legendary creature, elemental beast, 1/1 with Death Touch. Whenever a creature would be put into a graveyard, exile it with a void counter on it. Ulysses gets +1/+1 for each card in exile with a void counter on it. So essentially this thing is going to be an amazing card just to shut down graveyard synergies, but it's also going to allow for some awesome void counter synergies. For instance, say they discard 3 cards. Well, now those are going to exile. Technically, it's saying another creature, so technically it has to come from the battlefield. So if you're sacrificing some creatures, putting them into the graveyard, you're putting them into exile, which now boosts up Goliath. Essentially, it's going to keep consuming everything, putting it into exile, which then makes him bigger and bigger because he keeps consuming everything. So that's kind of the logic of it. Then we have some Lokis. We're not going to talk about these a ton, but like Kid Loki, 1 blue and a black, very simple, is kind of the leader. So it's a Lord card, but it's a Lord for variants as Guardians and Gods. So if you have a bunch of like Lokis who are those 3 types, they all get +3/+3. Then we have Boastful Loki, which is 3 and a black. Whenever it attacks, up to 1 target creature blocks it this turn if able. He wants to be in a fight. Whenever a creature dealt damage by Boastful Loki dies this turn, put a +1/+1 counter. If he takes down a creature, he gets bigger, and he's going to be constantly in battle. Just an interesting little effect. I thought fit the role. It was just, making like 7 Lokis for one set is a little difficult. And so I felt like I really needed to play on their unique traits in order to not make it feel like I was just redesigning the same card. All right, next we have a new kind of mechanic. So this is a Woober card, a legendary enchantment with the type Timeline. Then you can pay X and 2 mana to discard 5 cards to sacrifice it. And if you do that, you can create X random timeline tokens. Well, what does this mean? Well, if you watched my video on Black Panther, I did something very similar. Now, internally in the set design files, almost every single set is having some major change overhauls due to me remastering them. So just bringing them up to date with one of my more current style is in terms of mechanics and stuff like that. But I tried a mechanic called like innovation, I think it was. And essentially there were cards that could create random innovation tokens, which were basically token artifacts with abilities. And that is that coming back. But this time you're getting timeline branches. We're not going to talk about each effect, but just know that they are all symmetrical effects. So for instance, this one says whenever a player taps a land for mana, that player adds an additional colorless. So with, the Sacred Timeline, if you decide to sacrifice the timeline, it's going to split in a bunch of random directions, and a bunch of these are going to be on the battlefield. Most of them have an effect that, like, stacks. If there are multiple of them. I believe the only one that doesn't is the timeline in the upper right. That just doesn't stack, except for the fact that you can activate it multiple times. So they technically do all stack, so you could have one of the same or two of the same timeline, and it doesn't matter. You'll notice they are labeled branch 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That is just in case in the future I want to add more of them. It's very obvious that, oh, I did that. So this is something, Loki Season 2, I might add a couple more timelines. But yeah, that's typically how that's going to work. And this is not the only card that cares about them. There are cards that are just basically say like, oh, counter target spell, create a timeline token. I believe there's a card named Nexus Event that does that. You stop something that's supposed to happen, you also create an alternate timeline. And so we also have the episode spotlight cards. I do these for every single series. I'm not going to talk about them just because sagas are really long to read. But essentially, each episode has its own saga that represents what kind of happens in there. And there are various versions. Some of them have 4 things. Some of them have 3, but only 2 actually different types of abilities. Some of them are interesting, like Lamentus, where it actually has an ability. So, like, it's not, that upper part that normally has the reminder text actually has an ability on Lamentus, so it does something every time it triggers. So that's kind of interesting. But yeah, you guys can check those out. Either pause the video or check out the link in the comments or in the description down below. And that is it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know what you guys think about all this in the comments down below. Do you have any suggestions about anything? Anything you didn't like? Any wording errors? I caught one in there, and that should hopefully be changed by the time it gets uploaded to the site. But yeah, let me know what you guys think of all that in the comments down below. Also, check out my other Magic the Marveling videos. There's now a huge playlist of those. So yeah, I will see you in the next one. Bye.